So we start off with Phil Jones, who will give us the movement and transport perspectives. And I don't think Phil needs much of an introduction. You will all know him and his influential work. For many years, he has worked and campaigned tirelessly to bring together highway and urban design with the aim of creating places that meet the needs of people first and transport second. So we look forward to hearing Phil's view on the National Model Design Code. Over to you, Phil.
Great, thank you very much, Katja. Pleasure to be here. Firstly to say, yeah, this is a personal view, and even though the consultation on this closes at 11:45 p.m, so on the dot, on the 27th of March, I still need to kind of work through the detail myself. But this is my take on an overview of the document, and just sort of putting that into context. So I wanted just to first point, I think, is that there's a really close relationship between the National Design Code that we've had for some time and the new National Draft Model Design Code and Manual for Streets 1 and 2, which I'm very pleased to see are key references in both documents. So actually come ahead of other documents, but there are lots of documents that are referred to in the National Design Guide. I think what we're finding here is we're putting back design guidance and sort of replanting the scorched earth that we had when documents like By Design were taken out. When we had a National Design Guidance document with no pictures in it, which is unbelievable, really. So it's quite terrific that Manual for Streets is up there, and I think it's good that government is recognising that design matters and that streets are central to good design. So one of the things I did was just have a look at the mentions of the word street in the National Design Guide to begin with, and we've got 76 in there, and that comes ahead of parking and walk or walking and cycle or cycling and public transport. And then when we come to the Model Design Code, we're up to a whopping 255 mentions of the word street, and I've actually took out the 256th, which is the address of M8CLG. So yeah, it's clearly streets are central. It's all about the streets, which is great to see. So just going back to where we were with the National Design Guide on movement, I mean, I think there's some good stuff in here. Connections to destinations within the site and beyond its boundaries, clear pattern of streets, but it's all rather wordy, and I think that's perhaps one of the charges that have been levelled at the National Design Guide, and I think the Model Design Code is putting a bit of meat and a bit of certainty behind that. So we've got the Model Design Code and we've got the guidance notes, where we look at for some key information. Obviously, it's still fairly high level, and when it comes to streets, the guidance notes and the Model Design Code refer to Manual for Streets, and we know that we are going to get a new Manual for Streets, which is going to bring together Manual for Streets 1 and 2 later this year or perhaps early next year. And the two are kind of informing each other. So the thoughts in here about typologies and how it all fits together, I'm sure will be reflected, and I'm on the project board for that. I'm not involved in the writing of it this time, but I'm on the project board and been having conversations with the WSP led team with Andy Cameron and others, ITP, that are producing it, and I know they're watching very carefully how this all comes down. So it's words like detailed guidance and specific detailed parameters that I think give me a bit of confidence that we're kind of getting somewhere, because one of the charges against the original Manual for Streets is that it didn't quite hit the spot. I mean, I think there was some good stuff in it, I would say that, wouldn't I? And I think it did move things on, but it didn't quite have the impact that it should have done. I remember it was Tim. Many of you will know Tim was part of the drafting team, and I remember him quite distinctly saying we should have as few numbers as possible. When we give people numbers, it just stops them thinking. Let's take it away and make engineers think. But of course, the culture of engineers is pass fail, and understandably so, because they are held liable so often. So engineers do need some certainty, and I remember getting very cross with a highway authority DC officer who said, "Can't work to Manual for Streets, it's too fluffy." But when I came away thinking, well, she has a point actually, and if it's not working for her, then it's not working. So I think this is a chance for a bit of a reset. Manual for Streets said a lot about hierarchies and this idea of a dual hierarchy of movement in place. And when I first read or saw that diagram in the model design code, street hierarchy, it was purely about movement. I thought, oh gosh, are we sort of going backwards here? And it talked about the hierarchy following those movement strategies. And you know, we seem to have lost this diagram that was in Manual for Streets and Manual for Streets 2, that was led by the work of Peter Jones, that talked about place status alongside movement status as giving this sort of dual hierarchy to streets. But actually, I think the way it's been handled, I think it still works, because there are some good words in here. Different streets play different roles depending on movements, but then it talks about built form and the uses around the design of the street space itself. And street types include multifunctional streets, all have different place and movement functions. So I think the idea of streets having place and movement functions is in there. We just don't see it in this sort of two-dimensional hierarchy. And I know there are some people like Colin Davis who've argued passionately that you can't put place on a graph like this, and it doesn't work. Place is too complicated, too nebulous to be put on that simple linear scale. So maybe there's something in that. And so what we actually get all of those kind of place functions of streets are talked about in the public space section, not in the movement section. And you know, I looked at that and I thought, actually that kind of works, and that's where it's in the public space where you find the more detail about how we design these kind of linear spaces, I suppose, that we can think of them as. Connectivity, I like the things that he talks about connectivity, and I like this simple rule, which I hope will work when developers test it. Each street has more than one connection to another street, and I think that's pretty good, really. And it talks about street types and within the typology, and says we should only have cul-de-sac at the tertiary level of street type. So that's kind of interesting. And I also like what he says about filtering. Filtered permeability. This image is from Waltham Forest, which has been held up as a sort of a really good exemplar of filtered permeability within a grid network. And it's positive about that. And he talks about permeability for different users can be controlled by measures within the street space to prevent through movement. So I like that. I think when Manual for Streets came out, I know there were many active travel campaigners who think it's too pro permeability for motor traffic, and maybe this is redressing the balance of that. So we can have connectivity for all modes, but more connectivity for the most benign modes, the most sustainable modes, and that's a really interesting development. You know, to get away from this is so much pod development with private drives that prevent actually design out connectivity and create these sort of executive homes where people who live there suggest they prize the fact that nobody else can walk past their house. What Sue McGlynn calls kinetophobia, the fear of movement. And so hopefully gets away from this. But will it get away from this? This is the other problem of connectivity, which is driven by land boundaries. So here, you know, we have a site, okay, it's not particularly well connected internally, but it's extremely poorly connected externally, one way in and one way out, and it's another skin of the onion surrounded by cul-de-sacs. You know, if we're going to drive connectivity beyond the site boundary, then that's going to take some really robust policy or decisions by planning authorities, because that's often constrained by land ownership. And you know, our planning authority is really going to refuse consent when there is not more than one means of access to a site, and you know, that's going to be very interesting to see. Is it going to challenge that? I think public transport. I mean, there's some good words in here about public transport key to providing people with choice in everyday journeys. And says a site or location has good public transport accessibility when dwellings have a public transport stop within walking distance. And I thought about that. I thought, actually, I'm not sure that's enough. You know, that you could achieve that if your public transport stop had one bus a week. So I think, you know, I question some of the stuff that's in here about public transport. And there are other good references that we could refer to. So again, the work of Tim Farrow with CIHT, some really good practical guidance to how we plan and design for buses and what good public transport access looks like, and I think there's some references there. So I think that little bit of the National Model Design Code probably needs a bit of beefing up. But active travel is dealt with very well, and I mean, it's interesting that it's within the guidance. It's actually a tier above public transport. It's raised up to the level of connectivity, and perhaps, you know, that's interesting and shows the importance of that for health and well-being. And just some little details that I don't know if you can see, but just the fact we've got things like continuous footways in the diagram, just, you know, slipping in there. I think that's really nice. Again, this is Orphan Forest. It's good to see local low traffic neighbourhoods cited. They are supported in Local Transport Note 120. This has just come out, and Gear Change, the government's cycling and walking plan, very positive about low traffic neighbourhoods. So it's good to see that in the National Model Design Code. But it says maybe appropriate only where supported by the local community. So that's a bit weak-willed. Is that a kind of reaction to some of the negative press, unnecessarily negative press, I think, that we've seen around low traffic neighbours? And when we say that, you know, what community, if this is new build, what community can we ask about that? So I think we could be a little bit stronger, because Active Travel England is going to be a player here. It's not mentioned, you know, probably quite rightly. But for those of you who are not aware, Department of Transport is working now to work out what Active Travel England is going to do. But one of its functions will be a statutory consultee within the planning system. So we'll have something to say about that. And then so streets and places, we find that in the public space section of the design code. So here we talk about different types of street and public space, referring back to the hierarchies. That's all good. And we see different typologies of streets. These are exemplars, and they may not be exhaustive. And then where we might see them, and that's all going to come in the codes. That's great. And they talk about the dual functions of movement and place. So as I say, it's in there. It's just not kind of represented in quite the same way as Manual for Streets. And then we get the typologies, and I like that. And I mean, there's some details I need to look at. Are they right? It'll be interesting to see how, when Manual for Streets takes this forward, even when there might need to be a bit of iteration here coming back. And I like the little pop-ups that work in the PDFs that tell you a bit more about it, and we get these isometrics that show the relationship between the buildings and the movement on the streets and how that all works. So I think they're very good. And I mean, it's interesting. We've been doing some work recently for Homes England as a kind of stopgap, possibly before Manual for Streets comes along, and that we're going to talk about this at their design day in April. Where again we talk about typologies, and here we just, in the context of big urban extensions, principal main street, secondary street, tertiary streets, and then these edge lanes and private driveways, of what might we see, what features might we see, and categorising them with place, movement, access, parking, drainage, which are the street functions in Manual for Streets. So there's some kind of link up there with the thinking that we've been doing, which is good. And then, you know, the images about what green looks like for those different typologies. So that this all seems to be going in the same direction. And then, of course, we're saying this intention that all new streets are going to include trees. I mean, that seems to me to be a little simplistic, and I'd be interested to see what others think about that. It's obviously, trees are great, we all love trees, but is it right that every street should have trees in it? I don't know, but it is in there, and you know, at the moment, very few new streets have trees. And when they do go at planning stage, they tend to disappear. Amy Burbage of Homes England done a great presentation about the disappearing trees between planning and implementation. So even if we get some street trees in, that's great. So that's my final slide. So I think the guidance is good, is well structured. I think it builds on, reflects Manual for Streets principles. It's got a slightly different take on how movement and place is talked about, but I think it works. I think public transport needs a bit more detail, but I think active travel is handled well. I'm sure others will have detailed comments, but for me, I think it's a good document, and I wish it well. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Phil. That was a very good overview, very positive view, and encouraging view, which is great to hear.